Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Today on Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, we cover the basics of the canonical Gospels. What are they? Why were they written? And by whom? But before we do that, Bart, hello, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Got friends coming over for dinner tonight. So
Very nice.
when we're done recording this, I'm off to cook a lasagna. I I have a mean lasagna. It's not mine actually. It's moosewood, but I wamp it up a bit, and it's fantastic. I don't know why
I
you
love a
try.
good lasagna.
And how you doing?
Similarly, actually, I just started a chicken curry before we started recording, so that's simmering away in the kitchen
Chicken
for dinner.
curry. Okay. So
Yes.
right. So this is the English in you because it used to be in England the only really good food was Indian.
It is still the case, unless you are a fan of roast meats, in which
Yeah.
case there are some decent ones, but no.
Although it has
Curry is
gotten
the best.
it has gotten much better in England now. They don't boil their vegetables to death anymore.
My grandmother, rest her soul, did definitely boil vegetables until they were very, very dead. So
Okay, yeah, okay. Well, good luck with the curry.
thank you. I hope you have fun at dinner.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
planning it.
so Gospels, why should we care about them?
Well, yeah. So there are main sources for the historical Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have other gospels that are later, but are even more obviously legendary and of very little help historically. And outside of that, there aren't a lot of sources for knowing about Jesus. And um, it's not just my opinion. A lot of people in this world think that in the history of civilization, there's hardly anybody more important than Jesus. So the Gospels are give us access to that. They're the first 4 books of the New Testament, the most widely read books of the New Testament, especially Matthew and John. And so for anyone interested in Christianity, of course, they're key, but also just for history of our civilization. Yeah, they're right up there at the top.
Wonderful. So when we talk about them, then exactly what are we referring to?
So the word gospel originally didn't refer to a book. The word in Greek is euangelion, which literally means a good proclamation or the proclamation of good news. And it could be used if, like, you won the war and the messenger comes back, he proclaims the euangelion, the good news. And what ends up happening is that the Christians, right soon after Jesus' death, probably began to say that his death and resurrection provide the good news of God's salvation. And over time, later, not in the first century, but into the second century, people start referring to the written codification of this good news as themselves gospels. And so it is interesting that the gospels are called gospels. They're called proclamations of good news. They're not called biographies of Jesus, and they're not called histories. They're really preaching. I mean, they're preaching a historical narrative, but it isn't, by everybody's recognition in the ancient world, these were not meant to be. I mean, of course, people thought that things in them happened, but they weren't being described in a way so that they kind of to satisfy historical interests. And even today, of course, most people don't read them out of antiquarian concerns. Most people read them because they're Christians and they think this provides the good news of how Jesus brought salvation.
So do we know who wrote them?
So they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, obviously, and they've been called that for a long time. And so most people simply assume they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those 4 names are significant. Matthew and John were both said to be disciples of Jesus, 2 of the 12 disciples. And so Matthew was the tax collector, and John is the one called the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John, John the son of Zebedee. And so they'd be 2 people who were with Jesus and are telling their accounts according to this tradition. Mark was not said to be one of the disciples. He was a close companion and a secretary for the Apostle Peter. And so in this understanding things, Mark is providing Peter's view of things. And then Luke was not only not a disciple, he wasn't a companion of a disciple. He was a companion of the Apostle Paul in the tradition. And so Luke is providing, I guess they would, yeah, well, they do actually say that. The early church fathers say that Mark provides Peter's view and Luke provides Paul's view. So you end up then with two disciples and the companions of the most important apostles. Mm-hmm. And so those are the four gospels. So that's the tradition. And since the 19th century or even earlier, scholars have come to doubt that those are right.
Do we know if who wrote them is a little fuzzy? Do we know when and where they were written?
Yeah, well, they all kind of tie together. And so so in terms of, I'll do the who, when, and where all together. So the who is, we actually don't know the names. There are very good reasons that we'll probably go into depth in this for each of the gospels. Mm-hmm. There are good reasons. There are reasons why people chose these names. They didn't just pick them out of the blue. There are actually some logical reasons for choosing those names. But most scholars today are absolutely convinced, most historical scholars are convinced that they were not written by, Matthew, the disciple, John, and these other two for a number of reasons. I'll give you just one reason. We'll talk more about this later, but just in terms of the disciples of Jesus, our only information about these people, historical information, comes from the Gospels themselves. And we know from the Gospels that Jesus is from the little town of Nazareth, which was the archaeologists have dug it up. It's a small little place, not many, a few hundred people probably lived there. And it was in a rural part of Galilee. And Jesus' disciples come from this region, from rural parts of Galilee. So not big cities, and not in Greek-speaking areas, but in Aramaic-speaking areas. And almost certainly, the places they came from didn't have schools. Mm-hmm. It's not like today where everybody goes to school. Only the upper crust elite would go to schools. And so that's throughout Israel. It's throughout the entire Roman Empire. But in Israel, the native language was Aramaic. And the only people who would learn to speak Greek were the highly educated, who are kind of top-level businessmen or governmental officials, or just the general elite. And Jesus and his disciples were not among the elite. And so the very idea that somebody like John, the son of Zebedee, who's a fisherman, mm-hmm. Which is a low level, it's a very low level, he would require no education. The idea that he writes fluent Greek is, no, that didn't happen.
Unlikely.
Yeah. So, but part of the deal with who is the when question, because scholars have long had reasons for thinking, and it is a virtual consensus among historical scholars today, that Mark was our first gospel written, and that it was written around the year 70. That's the time when the Jewish war was ending, and most scholars date Mark to a year or two after the Jewish war for reasons internal to mm-hmm. sorts of things that Mark says in the gospel. Matthew and Luke both used Mark as one of their sources, which is a pretty clear view that almost everybody has since the 19th century. But that means they were writing afterwards, and their reason for thinking is some years after. And so usually they're dated in the 80s, around 80 or 85. And John is, even in the ancient world, was understood to be the last gospel, and it's dated in the 90s, 90 to 95. Well, if these people were mature adults when Jesus was in his ministry in the late 20s, it's really kind of unlikely that they're, and so you get these stories about John being this decrepit old man who's still writing. It's, okay, maybe if he's like 100 years old, it's kind of unlikely given life expectancy in the ancient world. And so that's the who and the when. What was the other one? Was it where or why?
Yeah. We'll get to the why, but no.
The where. Yeah, where. Boy, we wish we knew where. People have always made guesses. Educated guesses about where the where was. It seems unlikely that the authors were living in Israel. We have only one surviving author from the entire first century from Israel who wrote in Greek. Wrote a narrative in Greek. That's the Jewish historian Josephus, who's very, very important. He's our main source for understanding what was happening in the first century in Israel, the time of Jesus in the New Testament. And he had trouble learning Greek. He was like he was at the top. He was like not just 1%. He was like 0.1% of the elite in Israel. And he ended up in Rome and was learned how to write Greek. And so the idea, so these books are written in Greek, so probably not in Israel. And plus they make mistakes about geography and stuff and customs among the Jews in Israel. And so somewhere in the diaspora, but where? The traditional locations that people say is that Matthew, they say, was written in Antioch. When you start digging around for why they say that, it ends up being because Matthew's very concerned about Jews and Christians in relationship to each other. And where would you have a big urban population that has both Jews and Christians? Antioch. Okay, Antioch. Yes, that's one of the choices. There are others. And so I don't know. I don't find that very convincing. Mark is almost always said to have been written in Rome, on the theory that Peter was in Rome and Mark was with him. There's nothing about Mark that makes you think it was written in Rome. People used to say, well, it has Latinism in it, Latinisms. In other words, they have Greek words that actually are taken out of the Latin. So, well, that's Rome, right? Yeah, well, Latin was spoken throughout the entire Western Empire. And so you don't have to live in Rome to speak. So we don't know there either. John is usually placed in Ephesus because of later legends, putting John in Ephesus. Legends in some of the apocryphal books that we'll be talking about later on the podcast, but they're completely legendary material. Even though if you go to Ephesus, you can still see his tomb, but these are just later legends. And Luke, people kind of fluctuate from where it's from. So the short answer is, I'm afraid to say, we don't know where they were written, but we sure wish we did, because it would tell us a lot about what Christianity was like in that town, that city.
So we're not sure about who or where, pretty certain on the when part. Do we know how widely they circulated in antiquity?
We have some ideas about that. It's tricky early on. So in the early 2nd century, there are church fathers who appear to be quoting, especially Matthew and Luke, but they don't call them Matthew and Luke. They say, they'll quote the words of Jesus. They'll say something like the Lord said, and they'll quote something that's a lot like you got in like the Sermon on the Mount or something, and so you think, well, maybe that's where he got it from. Or maybe, he's saying the Lord says it. Maybe he just means that, like, he's heard this, that people are telling stories about what Jesus said outside of the gospel. That's how the gospel writers got their accounts. They heard stories. They've been in circulation for years. And so it's not quite clear, but I think a lot of scholars think that some of the authors of the early 2nd century, such as Ignatius and Polycarp, are quoting texts, and maybe Matthew and Luke. We have a church father named Papias who refers to Matthew and Mark, and says they're written by people named Matthew and Mark, but he doesn't quote them, so we don't know if he's talking about our Matthew and Mark. And everything he says about Matthew doesn't apply to our Matthew. And so it seems like, I don't know. So it's when you get to the middle of the 2nd century, Justin, who is one of the first real intellectuals of early Christianity, he was a philosopher in Rome who converted to Christianity. He's most commonly known as Justin Martyr. Not because martyr was his last name, but because he ended up getting martyred. He quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke fairly extensively. He doesn't call them Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he calls them memoirs of the apostles. And in 2 places, it looks like he's quoting John as well. And so he doesn't call them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But that's in Rome. So they're certainly in Rome. They appear to be in Asia Minor, because of Ignatius and Polycarp, and so they're spreading around. By the end of the 2nd century, Irenaeus, who's a bishop of an important church in Gaul, modern France, in Lyon, the same town we still have today, he quotes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he actually quotes those books. So we know that by then, and the way he talks about them, it's clear they're really widely known by this time. Same time, Tertullian, North Africa knows them. So by this time, I think they're throughout the Mediterranean by the end of the 2nd century.
So you've used a few words to kind of describe what the Gospels contain. Justin called them memoirs. You've used biography, history. What genre were these, or are these texts in terms of ancient literature?
It's a great question because it's been much debated among scholars. There's a pretty good consensus right now, but for years and years, scholars said these Gospels, the genre is sui generis. It didn't exist before. The Gospel is a brand new genre of literature. And now people don't think so. About in the 70s and 80s, people started digging deeper into that question, and they came up with a number of interesting theories. There are a number of ideas about what genres they were most like. So when we use the word genre, it's important to understand what we mean. We classify writings according to what kind of books or articles or whatever they are. So every writing has a genre, and so an author doesn't tell you what a genre is. She just writes a book. But if she writes a book that's about somebody's life, that's a description of their life and what happens, you call that a biography. If it's a long work of fiction with many chapters and characters and character development and plots and things, well, you call that a novel. If it's shorter form of that's much shorter, you might call it a short story. And so you get different kinds of poems. You got limericks and epics, and so people, when somebody's writing, they're following some kind of guidelines that aren't written down. They're not official. They're not required, but you've got certain ways of writing. So when you write a science fiction novel, you write it in a different way with different expectations for your reader than if you're writing, an article for the sports page. But they have these kind of standard things that typically follow. And so in some ways, a genre is kind of this unspoken contract between an author and her readers. So that the readers know what. So if you read about a major chemical disaster that's wiping out New York State in a science fiction novel, you pretty much know kind of what that's all about. If you read it on the front page of the New York Times, right, it's because the genre is different. These are two different things. So when it comes to the Gospels, the question is, did these authors, were they imagining they were doing something similar to other things going on in their environment? The most common view right now is that they are ancient forms of biography. The ancient biography in Greek were called bioi. The word bios, the singular, means life. And so authors wrote bioi, and some famous authors, Plutarch, for example, and Seneca, they wrote biographies of people. The reason scholars for years were reluctant to call the Gospels biographies is because they do have stark differences from most other biographies. And they certainly have stark differences from modern biographies. This is the big problem. So modern biographies, people do their research, right? They go to the library and they read a bunch of books and they find the dates. They try to get the dates right, and they go for the accuracy. And they often show character development where a person like starts off and they have these formative influences, their parents and their teachers and events that happen to them. Their personality changes over time. They learn things, and so both of those things, this deep concern for getting everything accurate and this concern for character development don't happen in ancient biographies. The ancient biographers tried to be accurate, but a lot of them had to rely on oral sources. They didn't have written sources of material. And they were often quite frank that the point of their biography was not to give you a history lesson about, the names and the dates. The point was to show what kind of person this was so that you could either emulate who they were or avoid being like them. And so the Gospels are like that. They are meant to be to show the highlights of who Jesus was. They're not overly accurate by modern standards, and in none of these do they have character development. Why don't they have character development? Because they were living before Freud. so the idea that we have these that's kind of a shorthand, but the idea that we have formative influences that affect our personality was not held in the ancient world. In the ancient world, you were born with who you were. And so that's why ancient biographies begin with their subjects as children, because what they do as a kid shows what they're like. And so it's kind of reflecting what's going to happen later in their life. And so that's why you tell kids stories in biographies. And yeah, okay, right. So that's the genre question.
Excellent, thank you. The big question, I suppose, is why were they written? What purpose did they have?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's sometimes often that question is often asked in relationship to the when question, because why would they wait? I mean, if Mark was written around the year 40, I mean around 70, it's 40 years after Jesus. Why wouldn't they be writing these things right away? And why are they waiting 40, 50, 60 years? And there are a lot of explanations people give, but one kind of obvious one for many people is that the earliest Christians thought that the world was going to come to an end pretty soon. Even in the Gospels, Jesus predicts that generation won't pass away before the end comes. The Apostle Paul clearly thinks he's going to be alive when Jesus returns. So they were expecting the imminent end of the world, which I think Jesus himself was expecting the imminent end of the world. And well, if the world's going to end next Thursday, there's not much point writing a book about Jesus. What's the point? And so I think as time goes on, the disciples start dying. You don't have anybody who's around who knew Jesus anymore. And people are thinking, we probably ought to get this down. and so I think that's one reason people start writing, is because they know there is going to be a posterity and we need to write for it. Second thing to say about it is that these books were almost certainly written as inside literature. They're not written to convert people. They're written for Christians by Christians telling a Christian story. That doesn't mean that they were not useful for Christians who wanted to evangelize people. They were extremely useful, but they were not books that you would hand to somebody on the street and say, here, read this so you can convert. We have no evidence of that happening at all. And it's completely implausible when you think about it, because Christians were thought to be a kind of a weird group. And why would you, no, I'm not going to read that, sorry. And so, but the reason they're valuable for evangelism is the same reason that in the modern world today, when you have people who are Christian apologists, who are defending the Christian faith, you get them in America and in England and other parts of the world where they come up with reasonable arguments for why Christianity is true and is the only true religion. And they have a series of arguments they have to prove that the Bible is the inspired word of God, or to prove that Jesus was raised from the dead, or to prove things. They write books about that, but they never hand these books to non-Christians. What they do is they give them to the Christians to learn the arguments to take them to the non-Christians. And that's what these Gospels are like. They're giving information to Christians, both to edify themselves, to educate them, to instruct them, to help them learn how to behave, how to live, how to believe, and also then what kinds of stories they can tell outsiders to convert them.
Thank you. Now, one of the things that we kind of know now, just in the modern world, is that eyewitness testimony is not super reliable. So if you ask 4 different people to write an account of things they've seen, the same thing, you will get 4 very different stories. And the Gospels are not 4 eyewitness accounts. They're 4 accounts written based on oral traditions, based on other stories, other texts. So what differences then do they have between them? How do they change the life of Jesus?
So it's actually got 2 big issues going on here with this one, because they're both fundamentally important for understanding the Gospels. Let me just say a brief word about oral tradition. It's something we'll be talking about a lot on the podcast, I imagine. People do tend to think, well, the books are written by eyewitnesses and therefore they're reliable. And of course, in the modern world, starting in the early 20th century, especially legal scholars began to realize how problematic that is. If eyewitnesses were completely reliable, you wouldn't need a judicial system. Why take somebody to court? Just ask somebody what happened and he'll tell you. It's like, so, and so, but the eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable. And this has been hugely documented over the years, not just by legal experts, but by psychologists and others. People often say, well, in the ancient world, it wasn't like that. In the ancient world, eyewitnesses, like, they really remembered things. And moreover, even if they're not written by eyewitnesses, in oral cultures, people had to remember things well because it was their only resource. And so it's this common sense in the modern world that oral cultures are more reliable in preserving their traditions orally than written cultures. It turns out that there's been a lot of study of orality, on passing on traditions. There have been anthropological studies of modern anthropologists studying oral cultures today. There's a huge studies of memory, and you hear something, then you repeat it, and how all that works. And the brain has not changed in 2,000 years. We have not evolved that way. And so I wrote a book about all this called Jesus Before the Gospels. It's probably the worst title I ever came up with because nobody understood what it was about. It's actually about what we know about memory and oral tradition as that affects the stories about Jesus. And the reason it matters is because of the when question. If Mark's writing in 70, that's 40 years after Jesus died, how did he get his information? Well, people are telling stories. We know they're telling stories because they're converting people. Christianity starts out with this tiny little group in Jerusalem. In the New Testament, it's just about 20 people maybe who believe in the resurrection in the next week or so. And then, by the time Mark's writing, you've got Christian communities throughout Israel and up into Syria and over into Asia Minor and over to Greece and over to Italy, possibly in Spain, in North Africa, in Alexandria. It's like, you got Christian community. How's that happen? It happens because people are telling stories about Jesus and converting people. Well, where are they getting their stories from? There aren't any gospels yet. So they've heard a story, so they're telling the story. Well, where'd the guy where'd the guy who told you the story hear from? Hear from his wife. Well, where'd she hear? She heard from the next door neighbor. Well, where'd she hear from? She heard from her cousin. And it goes on like that for 40 years, right? And so whether you think the Gospels are accurate or not, that is a problem. And you need to know you have to figure out how to deal with that problem. So one reason for thinking that the story's changed during the oral tradition is the second part of your question. What kinds of differences are there? And so what I recommend people to do is to get a kind of a book that's called a gospel harmony, or sometimes they're called a synopsis of the Gospels. What they do is they print the Gospels column by column next to each other. So when they tell the same story, you'll have one column's Matthew's version, one is Mark's version, one's Luke's version, one's John's version. And so there's a very good one by Kurt Aland, A-L-A-N-D, the synopsis of the four Gospels. Make sure you get the one with that title, Synopsis of the Four Gospels, because there's other ones like that are in Greek. And so you want to get, that one's in English, Synopsis of the Four Gospels in English. And what you do is you read a passage in Matthew, then you read the same passage and you compare it word for word. And just see, are there differences? Are there changes, which you would expect? But are there any changes that are contradictory? And why are they contradictory? And you find these at the tiny little level, and you find them at the medium level, and you find them at the huge level. And so the way you do that is by doing a very careful comparison, which nobody does, of course. The way people read the Bible, of course, most people don't read the Bible, but when people do read the Bible, they typically have the way they typically do it is they use it as a kind of a Ouija board, where they have a question in mind and they open the book at random and stick their finger down, and whatever that says, that's what God's telling to them today. And so, I don't know if that's the best way. It's okay if you want to read the Bible that way, it's fine, but it's not probably going to get at what the author's trying to tell you. When people do want to know what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are saying, what they typically do is what you would normally do. You start at the beginning, you go to the end. So that's how you read a book, right? And, if God wanted to inspire a Ouija board, he could have done that. He inspired a book, and presumably it means you're supposed to read it as a book, which means you start with, the first word and read to the last word, and you kind of see how the whole thing goes. The problem with the Gospels, though, is that when you do that, when you read, I call that reading vertically, from top to bottom. Go to the top of the page, go to the bottom page, it's top to bottom, it's vertically. And that, of course, is the way we read books and the way we certainly should read the Gospels. But the problem with reading them that way is that when you read Matthew, you start, you got the life of Jesus, his teachings, his miracles, his death, his resurrection. Okay, then you read Mark, and you got the life of Jesus, his teachings, his miracles, his death, his resurrection. Sounds a lot like Matthew. Then you read Luke, and yeah, that sounds a lot like Matthew and Mark. Then you go to John, and well, that's kind of different, but yeah, it's basically the same thing. It's his life, teaching, miracles, death, and resurrection. And so they all sound the same. The way to realize that they're different is not to read them like that. It's to read them horizontally, as I was saying, where you've got columns and you read them across the columns. And you don't actually even need to buy one of these books to do it. Just read the story of the resurrection and just compare the accounts carefully and see if you come up with anything that, like, that's different, and wait a second, if that happened, then how did this thing happen? That doesn't make sense. I'm not talking about miracles can't happen. I'm saying that, like, if this story is right, that story, doesn't look like that could be right.
And one place that I really resonated for me when I started looking at the Bible more seriously was the Nativity and Jesus' birth, because when you go to church over Christmas, you get this very harmonized single narrative.
Yeah,
and it's not until you read them as individuals that you realize actually that's not at all how it is. Bits are preserved in different books, and then they're kind of pulled out and stitched together again.
Well, that's right. That's a great example, because it's the one I use with my students. When I teach my classes, I don't get up there and say, "Oh, you got all these contradictions. You can't believe this thing." I don't do it that way at all. What I do is I give them assignment early on in the semester. I say, "Okay, now let's think about the birth of Jesus." So Mark doesn't say anything about Jesus' birth. Jesus shows up as an adult, and John doesn't say anything about his birth. He shows up as an adult. So those aren't going to help us. The only two books we got him in are Matthew and Luke. Okay, well, that makes it easy then. So I tell my students, make a list of everything that happens in Matthew. Just boom, 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 boom. Now, make a list of everything that happens in Luke. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, compare your lists and see what's different, and see if there are any contradictions. Because the difference isn't a contradiction. We might actually have an entire episode on that, because that would be a fun one. Because some things are different, and some things are different, so different they're contradictory. And so in Matthew, for example, in Matthew's account of Jesus' birth, you have the wise men who come to visit Jesus as an infant to worship him. Luke does not have the wise men. Luke has the shepherds who come to worship Jesus. And so you would call that a difference, right? It's not a contradiction. It's just Matthew's got one and Luke's got the other. But there are other things that sure look like contradictions. As one example, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is in trouble when he gets born, because the king Herod finds out that the son of the king of the Jews has been born, and Herod's a little upset because he's the king of the Jews, and so he doesn't want any competition, and so he sends out the troops to slaughter every boy 2 years and under in Bethlehem, in order to kill whoever this is that's the king of the Jews. Joseph and Mary, Joseph finds out that in a dream that's going to happen. So he takes Jesus and Mary, and they go down to Egypt to escape. And they're in Egypt until Herod dies. And so walking to Egypt, of course, takes a while. And then they're there for a while. And then the word comes down. And then, so, I don't know how long it is, but they're down there for a while. Okay, that's fine. That's great. So in Luke's gospel, Luke doesn't say anything about King Herod being concerned about the boys, about him having the babies slaughtered, or anything like that, or them going to Egypt. In Luke's account, Jesus gets born, and then his parents have to present him at the temple. So he gets circumcised on the 8th day. Then 30 days later, they go up to the temple. On the 40th day, Mary has to perform a sacrifice to purify herself after giving birth. According to Leviticus chapter 12, it's 40 days later. And right after she does that, they return to Nazareth. Well,
No
okay. There's no, but if they're in Egypt, how can they? And if they go to they don't work. One of them can't. They both can't be right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the kind of thing you'll find a lot when you start looking for it in the Gospels.
And a brief aside, you have a course on the Nativity, don't you?
Yes, I do have on the Nativity. I think it might have been my first online course that I've done on my own about the birth. I did it last Christmas. I actually did it last Christmas, right before, because it was a comparison of Matthew and it was about what really happened at Christmas. Did the Christmas story really happen? I think that's what we called it. Did the Christmas story really happen?
There we go. So if you want more detail on that, go to bartehrman.com and use the code MJPodcast to get a discount. Sorry, just thought I should mention that for those who are interested.
Yes.
When then we're looking at the Gospels and their differences and how they portray Jesus, are they trying to show him in a specific light? Or is this purely just supposed to be an historical account of who he was and what he did?
So it's I think one of the most important questions, because I think I would say that everybody who writes anything is doing it for a purpose. I mean, the purpose may be to make money, although that almost never works. But usually people are trying to communicate something. So if you're writing a biography of George Washington or something, you usually have some kind of point you're trying to make, some insight you've got into his life. And the gospel writers certainly had points they wanted to make about Jesus. As I said, these things are called gospels. They are proclamations of good news. And so even though they are presenting what the authors consider to be historical events, they're presenting it for a reason, to proclaim the truth of Christianity. And that, of course, is colored the way they present their materials, of course. I mean, so they had to choose which stories to tell and how to tell them. And it was all contributing toward the end of proclaiming that Jesus is the one who brought salvation to the world. And so the point of these gospels is to show the importance of Jesus, both his life, I mean, his teachings especially, and his great miracles to show that he was the Son of God, but especially the death and resurrection. Some scholars have said that the way to understand the Gospels is that they are passion narratives with long introductions. And so passion narrative, passion in this context, it refers to the suffering of Jesus. Passion comes from the word that means suffering. And so these are narratives about Jesus' suffering and death and his resurrection. And they have long introductions, meaning like the point ultimately is what happens at the end. Because for these gospel writers, the death of Jesus is what brings about salvation. So they're not trying to write objective history. They do think that these things happen probably, but they weren't trying just to write history. And even if they were trying to write history, it doesn't mean they were writing history. You still have to evaluate whether they're accurate or not.
This episode has been mainly dealing with the canonical gospels, but we have a couple of minutes to go into the non-canonical. Are they doing the same thing? Are they telling the same kind of story?
The non-canonical gospels are interesting for lots and lots of reasons. And it turns out there are different kinds. There are some kinds that are like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there aren't too many like that. And in fact, the one that we think was probably like that is the Gospel of Peter, but we don't know for sure because it only gives an account of Jesus' trial, death, and resurrection. The reason it only gives that is because we only have a part of it. We don't have the whole thing. We just have a fragment. A lot of the some of the Gospels from outside the New Testament deal with just one period of Jesus' life. And so we have these wonderful books called infancy Gospels that are about Jesus as a young boy. And one of my favorites is the infancy gospel of Thomas, that tells stories about Jesus between the ages 5 and 12, where it turns out that he is the Son of God with all sorts of supernatural power, but he's also a kid who doesn't quite have it under control yet. And so he's mischievous, and it's like, whoa, this is really interesting. Others, like there's a gospel called the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is about the very end of his life. That is allegedly written by this figure Nicodemus from the Gospel of John, and it deals with Jesus' trial, death, and resurrection. And so there's that. That includes, in some versions of it, that includes Jesus going down to Hades to bring salvation to Hades, in the account of what's called the harrowing of hell. And, ooh, that's pretty interesting. So you get these that are on like one portion of Jesus' life. There are other gospels that are sayings gospels. That are we don't have too many of these, but we think that this Q source that we may have mentioned before in the Bible, we'll talk about later in the podcast, but there's a source that Matthew and Luke apparently used that was mainly sayings of Jesus. And we have one, the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945, is a list of 114 sayings of Jesus. And so there, my point is, there are gospels outside the New Testament. There are a range of them. Most of them claiming to be written by apostles. None of them were written by apostles, and on different periods of Jesus' life, or just on his sayings, or on related things.
Thank you. And we will definitely be having several more episodes, I'm sure, looking at non-canonical gospels. And as I've mentioned before, we have at least one episode planned for each of the canonical gospels as well. So we will end this kind of introduction summary episode on the gospels there before, because I have the feeling we could probably talk about this for several more hours, and we don't want to give everything away right now.
I've taught an entire semester course on the Gospel of John, and we're scratching the surface.
Well, we're going to take a very brief break, and then we will be back with Bart's weekly update.
If you're interested in the Gospels of the New Testament, the book of Genesis, the resurrection of Jesus, the historicity of the Exodus, or anything else connected with the Bible, you should check out my online courses, where I cover all these topics and more. If you'd like to learn about the courses, check them out at bartehrman.com. You can receive a discount on any of your purchases simply by entering the code MJPodcast. Are you a curious person with a passion for learning but don't want to go back to school? You need to take a look at Wondrium, the streaming service that provides classes on just about everything of interest. The Crusades, neuroscience, Beethoven, photography, travel, and lots else. All presented by true experts in accessible terms. For a free trial, go to bartehrman.com/Wondrium. If you decide to subscribe to Wondrium, this podcast will receive a referral fee, but that'll have no effect on the cost of your subscription, and you'll be supporting our show.
This is Bart's Weekly Update, where we get to catch up on all the latest about Dr. Ehrman's book releases, speaking engagements, ehrmanblog.org happenings, and online course launches.
And we are back. So Bart, what do you have planned for this week?
So I'm excited about doing another one lecture course on. It's not going to be a course, I guess. It's going to be a one lecture thing. We mentioned in the interview, you brought it up just kind of serendipitously, that I'd done this thing last year around Christmas time about did the Christmas story really happen? And people seem to like having that kind of thing around Christmas. And I thought, I think I do this on my blog every year. I have some Christmas posts on my blog every year, but I thought I would do another lecture thing on a topic that a lot of people ask me about, and I'm going to call it the other virgin births in antiquity.
Oh, fun!
And so you have the story of Jesus being born of a virgin, and people often say that, well, that was typical. You have these sons of God who were born of virgins all over the place, and so the Christians are just picking up on that one. They're just modeling. And so I'm going to look into that. Is that true? There's certainly spectacular births in antiquity in Greek and Roman mythology are fantastic, and in other mythologies too. But is any of them a virgin birth?
Mhm.
Okay. That's what. So I'm going to do a lecture on that, and that'll be available on my courses that on my site. You probably actually have the address.
Yes, we will be giving the address in a few minutes. That sounds
Okay.
very interesting, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, before we wrap up, we do have some time for questions from our listeners. And remember, if you also have questions for Bart, you can submit them online at www.bartehrman.com/askbart. And we try and group them thematically so that they match the topic of the week, and we will get through as many as we can. And if you don't get in when you expect to, you can always resubmit and try again.
Now it's time for Questions from Listeners, where Bart answers real questions submitted by Misquoting Jesus fans. If you'd like to submit a question for future segments, please visit bartehrman.com/askbart.
So, Bart, did Jesus predict his death and resurrection as depicted in the Gospels?
Well, it's certainly true. He predicted it in the Gospels all over the place. Three major predictions in Mark, where they're called passion predictions. They are core, central to understanding Mark's Gospel. Matthew picks all three up. Luke adds one, and the Gospel of John, he's saying it all over the place. And so it's certainly true. He says it in the Gospels. And the question that's being asked is about the historical Jesus. And some listeners may not understand the question because they may think they understand, but the Gospels say he said it. So what are you asking about? And so what we're asking about is that since the Gospels, as we said earlier, since the Gospels are based on oral traditions, there are some parts of the Gospels that can't be as they were narrated, for one thing, because you have contradictions. And so you always have to ask, if you've got something in the Gospels, did this thing happen, this specific thing? And this is a major area of scholarship and has been since the 1770s. And scholars, some scholars spend their entire lives trying to figure out which of the Gospels actually what parts actually happened. It is widely thought among historical scholars that Jesus did not predict his death and resurrection. Some historical scholars think that he predicted his death, but not his resurrection. And people who are believing scholars who are, say, evangelical Christians say, well, if the Bible says he said it. And so he did predict his death and resurrection. But a lot of historical scholars think not. And well, it takes a long time to explain the reasoning behind it. And so I don't expect anybody to be convinced by my saying this. It's like you got to see the argument before you accept or reject it. But the basic idea is that these predictions so match what actually happened. And when you look at what Jesus was actually preaching, his main message, when you look at the earliest proclamations in the Gospels, it's not about his death and resurrection. The earliest proclamations are about something else. And so the idea is that Jesus' disciples thought he was the Messiah. They thought he was going to be the ruler of the kingdom of God that was soon to come. And instead of becoming the ruler, he got crucified. And they had to make sense of that. And they had to make sense of why Jesus, if he was the Son of God, didn't know it. That he was going to get crucified. And so a lot of most scholars probably think that he was said to have predicted this to show that he wasn't caught unawares, that he knew this was going to happen.
Thank you.
That of course is that may sound rather scandalous. I know, and I don't expect anybody to believe it because I just said it, but we'll have a long episode, maybe just dealing with that question.
Thank you. The Gospels never say that Jesus asked a slave to give everything up and follow him. Why not?
Well, the slave wasn't able to give up everything to follow him, for one thing. Jesus says, like his followers, like everybody else in the ancient world, just assumed that slavery was an acceptable institution. There was no debate about this, even within Christian circles after Jesus. They didn't and you think, how could that possibly be? Yeah, well, there are lots of weird institutions that are very harmful to human beings over the course of time that have not been questioned. There were times when slavery in America wasn't much questioned, and now you think those people are crazy. Yeah, by ours, yeah, absolutely. I mean, oh my God, but they didn't. and people in Jesus' day didn't. And so you wouldn't expect Jesus to. And so he can't tell slaves to leave their owners because the New Testament teaches them to stay with their owners, to obey their owners is one of the kind of more harrowing parts of the New Testament. So I think Jesus would never have even occurred to him.
Final question. Isn't the book of Acts a gospel in that the apostles and Paul proclaim the good news?
Oh, that's an interesting point. Yeah, it's a good question. If any proclamation of the good news is a gospel, then these are gospels too. That would be true then of every book in the New Testament, the epistles and the book of Revelation. It'd be true of every book about Jesus that's ever been written. It'd be true of every sermon you ever heard. You just call them all gospels. And so gospel in the broad sense, that would be right. You could call them proclamations of the gospel, but they're not a genre of the Gospels. Genres are literary forms of texts that have certain expectations in them. And a gospel, scholars debate actually how to define the genre of a Christian gospel. The way I define it is that it's any document, any text that is trying to detail events from the life of Jesus or the words of Jesus. And so, that's the focus of the document. That's what it's trying to do, is to provide information on the life and the events and the teachings of Jesus' life. And so the epistles and the Acts don't do that.
Thank you. Now, before we finish for the week, would you mind summarizing what we talked about and let people know where they can find out more about the 4 canonical Gospels?
Yeah, well, the Gospels are very, very important books. I mean, you could make a valid argument that the Gospels are the most important 4 books written in the history of our civilization. I mean, the Bible is by far the best-selling book, and the Gospels are by far the most read books of the New Testament. So they're hugely important. They are our only they're our earliest accounts of the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And so they're inherently important. And so the question is, what are they? Who wrote them? When did they write them? Where did they get their information from? How do we know their information was correct? Do they agree with each other? Do they contradict each other? And also something we didn't get into, if they have different points of view, what is Matthew's point of view? And is it really different from John's? And is it possible that Matthew, it's not just that, is it possible they don't just kind of contradict in little details about this and that? Is it possible that their entire understandings of Jesus are very different from each other? And that's one of the most important questions that we'll eventually be getting to. But my point is that these books are very popular, but they're not well known in the sense that they're not, people don't know what experts who've worked on these things for years and years have said about them. And so that's part of what we'll be doing in this podcast, is detailing some of the scholarly knowledge about them.
Wonderful. Thank you. Audience, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I know I certainly did, and I suspect Bart did as well. If you did enjoy what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. And remember also that you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses, including the Christmas course he did last year, the Christmas course he has coming up, and everything else over at www.barterman.com. Misquoting Jesus will be back next week. But what are we going to be talking about?
What are we going to be talking about? Oh yeah. So let me just say, these early episodes for the podcast, we're trying to hit kind of big issues. Like, we're not getting down into the weeds for much thing. We're hitting like these big issues just to show you how many really, really interesting issues there are out there. Next week, we're dealing with one that's very, very important, both historically and in the modern world. It has to do with women in the New Testament. How are women portrayed? What kind of roles did women have? Is it true that the Apostle Paul is a misogynist? Is it true that Jesus was a feminist? There are all sorts of things people say, and it's important to know historically. And there's a lot of information that people don't have about women in the New Testament. And so that's what we'll be talking about.
I am looking forward to it. I hope you will all join us then. So thank you and goodbye. This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app, or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.